Shruti. Sorry.
It's okay, no worries. Thanks, Simon, and thanks for engaging me in this conversation. I'm going to add two dimensions that have yet to, I think, to be covered with a little bit of a focus on emerging economies, although the second sort of set of my points around private sector, I think, was discussed and is a part of what's going on in the Renewable Energy Initiative in South Africa. So those two sort of sets of inputs I'm providing are one on low-income countries in particular, and the difference I would suggest between maybe some of the narratives that we've heard on emerging economies, and then particularly looking at the role of the private sector and where the private sector can play a part and how and if to engage the private sector into the first category of low-income countries. So starting off with that, the opportunities that we can see for low-carbon growth in developing countries are very different, I would suggest, than the ones that we're looking at in emerging economies. In some cases similar, but there's a good chunk that one should think about quite a bit differently. And this is because of the fact that most of these countries are obviously at a very early stage of development. And so, as the Global Competitiveness Report from the Forum talks about, these are all factor-driven economies, and so what we should be looking at are the assets that they can bring to the global economy. So I've sort of, pulled out 4 separate areas and 4 separate sets of assets that could be of great use in thinking about growth in these countries, with one of them in particular that is looking at the energy dimension of low carbon growth. So the first is slightly obvious, which is forests. 8 of the 40 countries that are identified as low income, so a good 20% of them, have more than 150,000 square meters of forest area. Now, particularly one of them, I think, has already had quite a bit of global attention, which is the DRC, for obvious reasons. But there's a huge scope for RED development in all of these countries. That all being said, and this is something that's going to be echoed in all of these opportunities around assets, is the real challenge around institutions and governance in these areas in order to attract additional capital, whether it be public sector financing or private sector financing or any of the enabling instruments, because of the challenges around institutions and governance in these countries. So in some ways, I feel like what I'm going to be saying is exactly the same thing that we've said for a really long time about these countries. So apologies for arguably saying things that are not actually very new. The second of the main areas I would suggest are building upon comments that Simon's made many times around minerals that are used in low carbon development. So the example that Simon often uses is lithium in Bolivia. As being one of the ways in which low-income countries have mineral assets that could be used in low-carbon growth in other countries. Now, there are a number of these different kinds of minerals, and I would suggest that a lot of the conversations so far, and understandably by the United States and China, around the scarcity of these resources is a little bit more complicated than people have suggested. The rare earths tend not to actually be hugely rare, but we don't have adequate production capabilities at the moment, or they're rather concentrated in a couple of countries. That all being said, there are still opportunities for the development of these resources, particularly at lower rates of cost for a number of different reasons in a number of countries. Now, is that investment available? It could be, again, if these institutional structures are set up. Examples of low-income countries with assets of this kind: Ethiopia has tantalum and coltan, which is used in electricity storage. Mozambique has the same, again, used for electricity storage. Burma has tungsten, which is used in wind turbines. Zimbabwe has platinum and lithium. And there's a whole stretch of other sort of lower middle income countries like Thailand and Indonesia that have a combination of all of these things. So the list is a little bit longer than Simon's suggestion of Bolivia, which I imagine isn't the only country that you were thinking of, Simon. But these countries will have to compete with others that are starting to extract these mineral resources. And again, these things are not necessarily in all cases very scarce, and have to be extracted in some cases as byproducts of other kinds of mineral extraction. So again, this is not an easy enterprise to be able to enter the sort of low carbon mineral world, but these could be opportunities for some of these countries. And in all the cases that I've mentioned, exploration is incredibly limited. In addition to that, one should also note that data on these kinds of minerals and their sort of geological locations in low-income countries is very, very poor. So there may well be other potential developments in a lot of places that are not yet on this list. Now, again, I should underscore pretty strongly that there are real challenges and risks, whether it's the sort of broad natural resource curse or things like conflict minerals. We've seen coltan development in the DRC be very, very challenging. So again, we must underscore the sort of governance requirements required to really leverage these minerals. The third set of opportunities I would suggest are around scarce resources and resources across the sort of food, water, energy, land nexus that in a lot of developed countries are becoming more and more scarce, but are assets that many developing countries, and particularly lower income countries, may not have fully leveraged quite yet. Now, as Bernice mentioned, we're in a world of resource scarcity dynamics with emerging economies consuming more and their consumption running up against constrained supplies of a set of these critical resources. These kinds of opportunities could exist in looking at sustainable intensification of food production in many of these countries. You could supposedly have a win-win between increased food production as domestically as well as linking that into the global economy. Again, the risks associated with these are relatively high, and we've seen that with the recent analysis on land acquisitions. Countries that do not have adequate land tenure arrangements or the broader sort of institutional frames around these contracts are not really doing quite well around international interest in the ability to produce food or biofuels in their countries. Again, the same for biofuels, again, assuming that these are not necessarily crop-based, and if they are, looking at how that relates to food production in country. But there is I would suggest, an emerging opportunity for countries to think about how global scarcity, they can help address global scarcity dynamics for their own benefit. And then finally, the availability of renewable energy resources. This clearly would help to answer a long-standing question around energy poverty, and that has been one of the real reasons for constrained growth in a lot of these countries. There's a possibility to leapfrog over fossil fuel-intensive energy production, as well to a decentralized energy model that is not constrained by some of the severe and significant capital costs associated with that kind of production. There's also the potential to develop regional development programs for energy, whether it's large-scale hydro projects such as the Inga Dam or Desert Tech in North Africa, two projects that have been sort of mythical for a pretty long time and haven't necessarily had a significant amount of movement, though recently in some areas they have. Now, again, these examples remind us that we need the right institutional frameworks and governance arrangements. That leads me to thinking about the challenges. In addition to these right institutions and governance, we have to think about whether or not they can attract the private capital that is of interest. If we look at the Global Competitiveness Report, of the 40 countries, 23 are actually ranked by the report, and only 2 of those are not below 100th on the scale. These are not attractive countries for private capital to come to for the obvious reasons that I've mentioned before. At the same time, the threats associated with maintaining a fossil fuel intensive energy pathway and from climate change itself are incredibly real, adding on the ones that are created by resource scarcity. So we're expecting, and one should expect, sort of increasingly volatile prices around a couple of key energy sources. For those coal importers of low-income countries, of which there are not actually a huge amount, the same sort of challenges that China's facing at large scale, though at a much smaller scale, will have huge impacts on these countries as prices become more volatile if they have to enter into international import markets. The same challenges around using low-quality coal and pollution within country. Oil prices going up and becoming more volatile is resulting in a huge set of challenges domestically, whether around inflation or increased transport costs and knock-on effects in terms of food prices. So there are a real set of challenges and threats, and particularly ones that could, in these kinds of poorly governed countries, result in political instability, combined with a number of underlying governance challenges. So I think the sort of broad set of some points on low-income countries that I would suggest is that there are areas in which these countries could pursue low carbon growth or leverage the sort of global trend towards low carbon development. But there are some of the same old challenges that these countries have had for a very long time that it reminds us that they need to be dealing with. And in addition to that, a series of new threats that are coming up the pipe that are going to really challenge those same governance and institutional arrangements that yet again need to get developed further. So moving on to the private sector, I would suggest there's a really large body of work that is in development on engaging private capital for low carbon growth. Now that understandably has been focused on mitigation opportunities and high mitigation opportunities within emerging economies, and to some extent in thinking about how to engage private capital into areas like forestry beyond the carbon market. I've been closest to the work that the World Economic Forum has done, which has started to, over the last couple of years, really focus on how to leverage private capital in addition to the carbon market. And that has covered areas like South Africa, India, opportunities around energy efficiency. And I would suggest that some of the big findings around that kind of work, and I refer everyone to the latest report that was released by the Forum in Davos this year that goes into a huge amounts of detail on this.
Read the title so people can pick it up.
It's Scaling Low Carbon Infrastructure Investments in Developing Countries. And I strongly recommend it to people who are thinking about looking at private capital and how to leverage private capital. It goes through the variety of different kinds of instruments that one would use to attract institutional investors and people across the value chain through what the Forum is calling investment grade public policies, as well as sort of collaborative activities between multilateral development banks and institutional investors and everyone in between. Now, that kind of an investment framework is most likely going to be developed in countries, again, with strong policy frameworks and governance arrangements, and is still a relatively sophisticated set of activities that still requires quite a significant amount of work. Now, that, again, doesn't necessarily exist in not only lower income countries, but a good chunk of the middle income countries as well. And the opportunity for the private sector in terms of mitigation potential is much, much smaller. And so from that side, my suggestion, in addition to saying, get into the details of thinking about the models that have been developed in China and South Africa and other countries around attracting private capital, is that we need to think about a new narrative for private investors for these other kinds of contexts, or even just change the idea around what kind of private investor we're thinking about. If we're talking about smaller scale, decentralized energy sources, it brings us back to social enterprise models. It brings us back to a lot of smaller scale energy solutions, whether waste to energy, small scale solar, wind, or hydro, and thinking about, again, some of the challenges that we've had in developing those same types of energy sources in these kinds of countries. So I would suggest that is probably an area of development that really requires a lot more thinking, in addition to doubling down on all of the work to leverage private capital into rapidly emerging economies that offer real mitigation returns, and in which most private investors are more and more having a lot more exposure to anyways through their normal sets of investment activities. So to summarize, I would just say that we for low income countries really do need to I would suggest think about assets and resources in addition to their energy pathways, and thinking about how to leverage those. We have a very long history of thinking about the kind of institutional structures, safeguards, how to deal with challenges like corruption, and think about how to equitably use resource revenues. But a lot of that needs to get channeled into this sort of new asset-based perspective on low carbon growth. And we need to build resilience in low-income countries to those threats that are coming up the pipe. Again, things that we've known for quite a while. And finally, on private sector engagement, doubling down on the kinds of, and building out the kinds of models that are developed in emerging economies, and coming up with the quite different one that we need for low-income countries.
Very interesting. We had a bit of a discussion about